Hello everyone, this is Dan again with another Random Thoughts video. In this video I wanted to give my kind of commentary, give my opinions on what we're seeing with NFL players and players in other sports leagues, mostly NFL players and some NBA players, although the season really hasn't started yet in the NBA. But I'm sure we'll see these guys doing the same thing. And also just general celebrities who are supporting these different national anthem protests, whether it be sitting during the national anthem or taking a knee or raising your fist up in the air and or just participating in or not participating in the traditional ceremony that we have during the national anthem, because they see that it's some sort of protest to them. I have an opinion, just like with a lot of other issues that are controversial and dividing. I have an opinion that doesn't really agree with either side completely. Um, that's not always the case. Sometimes one side's clearly right and the other one's clearly wrong. But this is one of those situations where I don't really think either side sees it completely the way I do. So I want to go ahead and give my point of view on how I view these protests and what I think the actual underlying issue is that the media as a whole doesn't want you to think about. Because I think that's a big part of why the issue is framed as patriots who say that you have to stand for the national anthem versus protesters who are brave and they say they don't have to stand. They're going to take a knee for some whatever reason. I think that the issue is framed that way in the media for a purpose. I think there's a reason behind that. I want to start off by saying that I think protesting in general is a waste of time. Now, there are some examples that run counter to that, like during the civil rights movement in the 1960s or whatnot. If you really can draw attention to something that people aren't paying attention to but yet may still care about, maybe there's some use in it. But for the most part, protesting to me just kind of makes you an asshole. It basically just says, look at me, I'm drawing attention to myself and the other people who are here without necessarily changing anything. If you want to change something, you don't just go out. And this can be one of your strategies, so I'm not totally against it. And I'm not against the right to protest. I think that should be a part of our constitutional system, which is getting more and more fragile every day. But I do believe you should have the right to protest. But in general, if you want to change something, you have to actually work towards that change. You have to say, this is what I believe in and this is how I'm going to get it done, or this is how I'm going to make it work for myself. To protest something that you don't like, you can do that, but I think that it's usually not very effective. That being said, I can understand people protesting the national anthem, not just of our country, but of any country, when they believe that there's actually something that betrays them, that involves their country betraying them somehow, or that involves, something that is so serious that they think is going on that's wrong in this country that you don't want to associate yourself with or endorse what your country is doing. So if there was a serious enough issue, if there was a real issue, quite frankly, that people were protesting against by not standing for the national anthem and not participating in the traditional hand over your heart, type of ceremony, or we don't usually think of that as a ceremony. That's kind of a you know, a word that usually pertains to something more extravagant, but it is kind of a ceremony when you put your hand over your heart or you put your cap over your heart, your hat. But I do think that there are reasons for not participating in that sort of ceremony by sitting or taking a knee or whatever. But those reasons should be based on reality, and they should be based on an extreme kind of situation, or at least a very serious situation that you're protesting. The problem that I have with the people who are part of this movement or phenomenon now of not standing for the national anthem is that they have essentially no reason to protest. They're just drawing attention to themselves. And let me talk specifically about how this is. It started out where Colin Kaepernick was saying, "Oh, I don't like police brutality against minorities." Then the next thing I saw, and there are probably other statements about this, because if you interview 10 NFL players who are part of these protests, you'll probably get 10 different answers for why they're protesting, or at least 5 or 6, that are significantly different answers. So it went from protesting police brutality against minorities to protesting the way minorities are treated in our society. And then now it's protesting Trump, because Trump said, "Oh, these NFL players who are doing this should get fired by their owners." So let me address all of these potential movements, or potential, I should say, causes for protesting. First of all, it's been debunked many times that black people are treated, or shot more, I should say, and killed more by the police than white people. Overall, white people are shot far more often by the police. Now, of course, there are a lot more white people in our society, but when you look at the violent crime rates and the proportion by race of who commits those violent crimes, black people are shot basically in proportion to the amount of violent crime that they commit. Now, if our society was racist, and more specifically, if the police were racist, why wouldn't the black people be shot more often than the white people, or at the very least, far more often than the amount of violent crime that black people commit? The reality is that black people commit like 7 or 8 times more violent crime than white people do as a whole in our society. And I'm not saying that to mean that black people have to be more violent. That's just the way things are. That's just the statistical truth. And the reality is that if our police force was actually racist as a whole, black people would be getting shot far more often than what they do. He would just find any reason whatsoever, and just, but there would be no, just like kind of the South back before the Civil Rights Movement. It's like there would be no effort to really just like find out what happened. You just blame a black person and probably shoot some black guy who didn't have anything to do with the crime. That's what would be going on now if it wasn't for, if we did have racism as an institutional problem with the police. Now, if you wanted to protest police violence and say that the police in general in our society have a shoot now, ask questions later kind of philosophy, I think that would be reasonable, because you can look online and you can see where people of all different races are getting shot in the back by the police. They're getting shot, they're getting choked out by the police. They're getting shot by police just using excessive force when they don't need to. You had that one chick in Oklahoma who, and I think this was a black guy, had pulled over the guy, and she was told that the guy had a gun and had a permit for it, and she just shot him. It's like, you have all these kinds of things going on, and I'm not going to look up the facts in all these cases, like specifically, because in general I see that there's a lot of police violence, and there's police violence against people of every race. And I can look at it, I can look at the facts and realize that in a lot of these cases there's no reason for someone to have died. But police in our society are poorly trained overall. Some of them have this mentality of just being above the law, and to me that's the issue, is that the police in our society in most cases are just above the law. And even when something like this happens, they don't really get much prison time. At most they get fired and whatnot. But you do have examples, and there are probably conservative people who disagree with me on this, and that's fine. But I do see examples of unwarranted police violence. But it's not just against black people. If it were, why would it be that white people are getting shot more often by the police, even with the differences in population? You would be able to look at the crime rates and say black people are getting killed much more often compared to what we would expect by the crime from the black communities. But we don't see any truth like that from the media. The second point that I mentioned was just being against minorities in our society in general. This protest movement was supposedly about, how black people have it difficult or minority people have it difficult. How? How is it that black people don't have the same opportunities, legally speaking, that white people have? How is it that affirmative action and welfare programs don't, you know, go to black people far more often than white people? Or I should say they do. It's just a true statement that most welfare, well, not most welfare, but a very disproportionate amount of welfare goes to minority people, particularly black women. Well, I should separate those groups: black people and women. So yeah, I mean, overall, you do have a lot of people, who are white trash or who are on disability, or who for whatever reason actually need some sort of financial assistance, and I understand that. But a lot of these special government programs that we have, just like for women, they're geared to helping minority people, or maybe not helping them, but just giving them handouts. At the end of the day, it just continues the cycle of poverty. It just continues the government dependence that you see in a lot of black communities and minority communities in general, or poor communities in general. But we can't talk about that. We can't protest government dependence. We can't protest, saying that, hey, we don't like the level of crime in our community and we're not going to stand for it, and it's time to start policing ourselves, and this national anthem protest, excuse me, is going to be about that kind of thing. Oh no, it's that minorities are mistreated. We're going to protest the fact that they don't get more free handouts, but from the government, basically. And then the third point about Donald Trump is probably the most ridiculous reason at all. It's like, you don't like something the president said, and more to the point, you don't like who our president is, so you're going to protest because you didn't get your way in the elections. You're going to protest because a politician said something that you don't agree with. Now, what did conservatives do for 8 years under Obama? Did they refuse to stand for the national anthem? No, because even though and I hesitate to include myself in this because I'm kind of more independent, even though I'm generally conservative. Um, did we decide that basically we were going to make some sort of, spectacle of ourselves? Did conservatives decide that, we were going to talk about how, Obama's bad and we hate what he says, so we're not going to stand for the national anthem anymore? No, because we knew that we were still all in it together, and the goal was still to better our society in the long run. The goal was to still want our country to succeed. But not when, Trump is president, not with these people in Hollywood and with these football players. With them, it has to be about, oh, we don't like what the president said, we're not getting our way, so we're going to raise our fist in the air when the Star Spangled Banner is playing. And so that's really the dumbest reason at all. It's like, you don't like something that the president said. Well, there are always people who don't like what the president says. How is that worth some sort of national protest? How is that worth saying, I don't respect my country? That's really fucking petty when you break it down. But that's where we are in our society today. We're at a point where, any reason to attack Trump or any reason to attack conservative ideas through some sort of demonstration is considered legit. And, at the end of the day, this is the problem that I have with it, is that these are silly ass, made up reasons that are really reminiscent of something like the Occupy Wall Street movement, where nobody knew why they were protesting, nobody knew what their goals were, and it was really all just about, oh, these people in our country have money and we don't. We're upset because we want free money. That's what the whole Occupy Wall Street movement was about. You could interview, like I say, 10 people during that event, during that so-called protest, and they all would have had a different answer for why they were there. And I feel like that's pretty much the same with what we see with these national anthem protests. it doesn't matter whether there's any logic behind it. You can show that the police shoot white people more often than they do black people. You can show that minorities are not discriminated against legally and socially. In fact, they have a lot of free handouts that, if you're a white guy, you're not going to have any access to. You can show that people don't protest just because they don't like what their leader says. And in this way, people, at least throughout the history of this country, at least in recent history that I can remember, don't just say, I'm not going to stand for the national anthem because I didn't like what Obama or, even to an extent, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. It's like you didn't see any of this kind of stuff at that point. And the reason is that it's just petty. And the reason, again, that these issues aren't discussed the way they should be is because the media wants to continue this sort of fight between minorities, black people specifically, and white people. The media wants a kind of racial tension because that gives them news stories, even if it's fake news essentially, and because ultimately they are Marxists. They want cultural Marxism and the creation of victim groups to succeed. And that's why it's not discussed. These protests, so-called protests, aren't discussed the way that they should be. That's why nobody says, hey, Colin Kaepernick, white people are shot more often by the police than black people. What do you have to say to that? What do you have to say to the fact that black people commit almost 10 times more violent crime than white people, and that most of that crime is committed against other black people in their communities? What do you have to say about government dependence? What do you have to say about having a black president or a half-black president for 8 years who did nothing for the black community or for minorities in general and just used your votes to get elected twice? What do you have to say for that? Oh, I don't like what Trump said. That's basically the response. And so that's the main issue that I have. And I want to wrap up with this idea. Ironically, if there was one group of people that would have the biggest reason for protesting, besides maybe men collectively, if men just decided to protest and say, we're going to take a knee and we're not going to go to work and we're not going to deal with the family law courts and the criminal court systems and just, not being allowed to see our own kids or having these false allegations that can go so far as to where there doesn't have to be any truth behind them. It's just listen and believe. And we get kicked off of college campuses, young men today, because, ultimately a woman's allegation is worth being expelled over. If men took a collective knee, our society would be really screwed. And that's something that maybe we could get behind, but we know that it's not going to happen. But if there's any other more specific group of people, mainly men, who would actually, ironically, have a reason to protest, it would probably be veterans. Veterans don't get paid well. They don't have the health care that, they need in a lot of cases. And they also have a lot of these men's issues where, they go off and fight, or they go off and are stationed somewhere, and when they get back, their wife has moved in with some other guy, and there's no repercussions for this whatsoever. You have guys like Timothy Blades and Terrence Popp who have been through these kinds of situations. I've watched enough of their content to know that they've essentially been betrayed in a lot of ways by the country that they worked hard for, that they stood for. So, ironically, if there'd be any group of people that would have a real reason to feel betrayed by their country, it would be our veterans. But yet, overall, as a whole, veterans are they're the last group of people that would ever do this because they're still patriotic and they still have respect for our country. But instead, it's these nut jobs in the NFL and these stupid celebrities who have millions of dollars who want to act like they're part of a victim group or that they support some sort of victim group. That black people are victims. That, that's basically all it is. It's trying to be part of a victim group so that you can collect some form of cash and prizes from the state and so that people will do for you and so that you can have power. That's all this is. So, that's my take on the whole national anthem protest, is that, You know, you can protest something like this if you want to. If it's a legitimate reason, then I can understand it, even if I wouldn't do it myself. But there are no legitimate reasons here. It's not about police brutality. It's not about somehow minorities being victims or, you know, being treated badly in a society which they get most of the handouts, they have most of the special benefits. Um, it's about, and it's not about something that the president said that they just didn't like. Oh, you know, we're going to protest what Trump said because he said we should be fired. Again, you'll never see conservatives do this. It's not about any of these things. It's about Marxism, cultural Marxism. It's about the creation of victim groups, and it's about entitlement. And that's the issue that really pisses me off about these idiots who think that they're victims in the NFL and in our country in general, who think this is a good reason for supposedly protesting, even though, just like I say with the Occupy Wall Street movement, all you're protesting is wanting free handouts that you're not getting. All you're protesting is wanting a position of power. And, you know, at the end of the day, you're just a bunch of idiots. And honestly, go back to playing football, go back to acting if you're in Hollywood or whatever the case may be, go back to playing your sport. And if you have an actual reason for not standing for the national anthem, even if it's a reason like the war on drugs or something like that that does predominantly affect, you know, minority people, or even if you wanted to talk about like the legal system itself and how, you know, there's been evidence, actual, you know, studies that have been done that show that black people get more crime for, or I'm sorry, get more time in prison for committing the same crime and all of this kind of stuff. Even if you want to go back to those sort of issues, I could respect that a lot more than this whole just victim entitlement mentality, which is the only thing behind the so-called protests that we see now.